When we saw the pandemic hit the United States in February and March, the first entities to take real action to protect the people that they were in charge of were not the states, it was not the nation, it were the net states. So Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook.
Olá, eu sou Jaime Wichowski. Esse é um programa especial produzido na parceria entre a Brazilian Student Association, BRASA, e o Canal Brasil, uma realização da FEComércio São Paulo. Hoje o formato do programa será um pouco diferente em relação ao que estamos habituados. Seremos 4 entrevistadores, eu e integrantes da BRASA, Juliana Choi, Natália Brandão e Thomas Borba. A entrevista será em inglês e nós vamos abordar temas extremamente relevantes e atuais, como tecnologia, comunicação e mídia. E vamos conversar sobre esses temas com uma das vozes mais relevantes hoje no cenário internacional no que se refere ao debate dessas áreas. A nossa convidada de hoje é Alexis Wichowski. Alexis é escritora, palestrante, professora da Universidade de Columbia, uma voz extremamente respeitada no que se refere ao debate e à interação sobre os temas comunicação, mídia e tecnologia. Brasa e Brasil, portanto, apresentam Alexis Wichowski. Alexis, welcome. It's a privilege for us to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
So, Alexis, I would like to start asking you the following question. A few years ago, you coined the expression net state, referring to big tech industries that were acting like states. The question now, we are going through a pandemic. What is the impact of the pandemic on this net states? To what extent the pandemic has changed the nature and features of the net states?
Thank you so much for the question. It's really interesting to see how net states have reacted to the pandemic. When we saw the pandemic hit the United States in February and March, the first entities to take real action to protect the people that they were in charge of were not the states, it was not the nation, it were the net states. So Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, they were among the first entities to say, we will have our workers work from home to protect them, their health. We will make sure that hourly wage workers are not going to lose their jobs, even if they can't come into the workplace. And we will provide family leave for people whose children have been sent home for school. Now, the country, the United States, had not done any of these things. And even individual states in the country had not taken these actions yet. So they really led the way to show how to take care of citizens during this kind of pandemic. And I think that has only continued throughout the pandemic. We've seen them continue to take these kinds of steps to set the standard. When will people go back to the office? How long will they be able to stay remote? Google has given their employees hundreds of dollars of credit to set up their home offices. And the family leave especially has been important because so many parents have struggled with trying to manage homeschooling their children while also working from home. And the fact that these net states were able to provide family leave made it possible for parents to make adjustments and make arrangements. It's the kind of behavior you would expect to see from a country, and it's really interesting that we're seeing it from these companies instead.
I know that Natalia has been thinking a lot about the net states and the pandemic. You have a question on that, Natalia?
I do have, Jaime. Actually, Alexis, your book, The Information Trade, show us tech industry in this new light that Jaime just mentioned, what you call net states, like big tech companies acting like governments in many ways. So we come up with examples of Amazon, Apple, Google, Facebook, and so on. And we also have in China, Alibaba framing themselves as an economy and not as a company and ecosystem anymore. And as for the nation states, we can get that the geopolitical scenario is being shaped. And we have Denmark later on, several countries appointing tech ambassadors for the first time in history. So my question is, Alexis, what is the tipping point? What is the common quality shared by these specific tech companies that may eventually turn them what you call net states?
So that's a great question, because just because you're a big company doesn't mean that you're a net state. McDonald's is a big company, Coca-Cola is a big company, but they have very different qualities than the net states. So the net states are based on technology products and services. And one of the things that distinguishes them is that they treat their customers almost like citizens of their products and services. So they are investing in services to protect them, for instance. Facebook has a counterterrorism team that's larger than the US State Department's counterterrorism team, which, given what's happened on Facebook with live streaming terrorist attacks, for instance, the New Zealand church attack, or mosque attack, excuse me, years ago, it's not surprising to us that Facebook would have a counterterrorism team. But just imagine for a moment if Coca-Cola had a counterterrorism team. It would seem crazy. So there are different kinds of activities that net states engage in that make it seem as if their users are not just customers, but citizens to protect.
Thomas, you also would like to add something, right?
Yeah, I have a similar question, Alexis, related to net states, or at least to most of net states. This year, Netflix released a documentary that seems to have been an eye-opener to many people, or at least provoked a lot of debate. It talks a lot about the concept of surveillance capitalism, meaning of companies making profit off people's personal data. And so I guess in this reality, I would like to understand, is surveillance capitalism an irreversible reality we just have to live in and embrace and accept? Or is there something we can do to still avoid it? If not, what are some of the challenges that we're going to face due to that?
So yeah, this is a really hot topic in the United States too. This documentary, The Social Dilemma, has really gotten people thinking about surveillance capitalism. And I think the reason that people are so taken by this particular film is that they kind of knew this was happening, but the film lays out in a very clear way that it's definitely happening. And people didn't necessarily sign up for this. When you joined Facebook or started using Google, very often I think we were thinking of the services that they provided to connect with our friends or find information, and weren't thinking about the secondary effects of what would happen to the data that was being collected on us. Personally, I think that the data that's already been collected on us is lost. We're not going to get that back. We can't unrelease the data that we've released. But I do think that there is an opportunity to create mechanisms to restrict the amount of data that we share moving forward, or to be in some ways compensated for that, whether it's by having better security and protections, better awareness of how the data is being shared and used. But I don't think there's a future in which we stop using these technology products. And I don't think there's a future in which they stop sharing and selling our data. I think it just is going to be done differently.
Juliana has a question I remember about how to work in the big tech industry and taking into account ethics. Could you make your point, Juliana, please?
Yeah, of course. I guess as a future computer engineer, one of my dreams, and as of many of my peers, is to work in one of those big tech companies, the net states, as you call them. And I like to think that most people who want to work in tech do so because of their passion for the amazing things that technology can bring us. And on that matter, I was wondering what can be done from the inside out. So what is the duty of future leaders who want to change things from the inside?
I think the people who work in tech companies have tremendous power, especially as a collective, to direct the ethical activity of the companies. So I'll give you an example. A few years ago, Google decided to enter into a contract with the Department of Defense. It was a tiny contract by Google standards, $10 million. They assigned about 10 people to the project. It was called Project Maven. And it was to enhance the drone technology video processing. So it was not a weapons contract. It was really about image quality and image processing. When the Google employees found out this contract had been taken into, they protested. Several people quit on principle, and they sent a letter to Sundar Pichai, who's the head of Google, saying Google should not be in the business of war. And Google dropped the contract. They left the contract. So it was an effective action by the collective of the employees. So I think that there is tremendous opportunity for, if organized and with the right kind of messaging, for the people who work in the tech firms to direct the kinds of activities that these companies take.
Right. Alexis, Thomas brought the issue of surveillance capitalism, but I also like to ask a question about your view on surveillance states, basically about what's happening in China. What is your assessment of the Chinese model and how the Chinese government is using technology to strengthen the regime?
I think it's very worrisome how the technology state has developed in China for a few reasons. One is the lack of transparency. It's not clear what they're doing with their surveillance activities. There is a lot of reporting around how it's being used to target individuals or minorities, for instance, in the Northwest, like the Uyghur minority. But it's not evident except from outside reporters, what exactly they're doing with that kind of footage and how they're using it to target these individuals and these groups. So the lack of transparency is very worrisome. Number two, the just sheer comprehensiveness is worrisome. The fact that it exists throughout almost every public space in major metropolitan areas. It just means that private citizens can no longer have an expectation of privacy, except for when they're in their homes, perhaps. And the third thing that makes me worried about the comprehensiveness of the surveillance technology in China is that they've created this really comprehensive system that is just ripe to export to other countries. So we're starting to see them engage in business endeavors with countries in Africa, for instance, and importing their surveillance system into those countries. So it's not just being limited to Chinese society, it's being shared with other countries who want to have that kind of comprehensive and authoritative surveillance over their citizens. So I think that it's something that we should be paying really careful attention to and empowering the whistleblowers in China who do have knowledge of how it's being used, because it's very opaque from the outside and even from Chinese citizens' perspective, how it's being used.
Alexis, so okay, we were talking about United States tech industries and surveillance by states. But as for us users, you know that we've been through 3 stages, right? We've been transformed from audience members to computers users, and over the past years, we turned it into something altogether new, citizen users. Would you be able to explain the differences between those roles, and considering how was this process of user evolution and what kind of responsibilities and risk criticality that came with them?
Sure, absolutely. So, before we had, even with the introduction of the home computer, or before the introduction of the home computer, we were all audience members. We watched television, we watched maybe live programming, and there weren't a lot of options. We had maybe 3 or 4 channels to choose from, and it was a passive process, number one. So someone generated content that we consumed. The news came on, we watched, we listened, and we just sat there and took it in. That's number one. Number two, it used to be a communal experience. So we would sit with our families or our friends and watch the same kind of information content together and consume it together at the same time. So it was a sort of shared information experience. With the introduction of the computer, we weren't just passive recipients of content. We could actually choose the content that we wanted to see. And then also, as computers proliferated and got cheaper, it's not like the family all shared one computer and we took turns or sat around it together. We had an individual relationship with the content that we were consuming. We were one-to-one. Then finally, in the stage that we're at now, we are collectives of users. We are networked together, having these group conversations on social media with people that we don't know necessarily. And it's evolving in real time. And the way that these companies are treating us more like their citizens as well as their users has led me to conclude that we are actually something in between. We are something like a citizen user of the internet technology that we're interacting with.
In terms of like having an actual impact, what would you see as the best approach? Finding a way to make the general public more aware of the long-lasting relationship they have committed to with the net states, although sometimes it is very not technically known? Or is it better for us to organize ourselves within the tech companies so that we can take action from the inside?
So that's a great question. And I think the answer is both. I think citizens need to be more conscious of how their information is being used and make demands. Because let's face it, if we all got organized and decided we're going to take our content and our activities off of, for instance, Facebook or Google, those platforms would be ghost towns. Facebook would be nothing without its users. So the problem is we're not organized. We don't have some sort of movement that has coalesced around people either boycotting or making certain demands about the kinds of ways they want their data to be handled. So people, I think, need to be both aware and organized. Organized outrage is an incredibly effective lobbying tool to make change happen. So that's number one. But number two, working on the inside is absolutely necessary. And in the same way, being organized. One person standing up against a gigantic company like Facebook is not going to have much success. They'll maybe just get fired. But if there is a movement within the organization, then there might be a chance to actually make a difference. So I would say that for both inside the companies and with citizens outside the companies, it's all about organization and safety in numbers.
Alexis, I'd like to ask you now a little bit about the relationship of politics and democracy with these tech issues that we've been talking about. Specifically the disinformation crisis or the post-truth crisis that I think that we're currently in still. And interesting enough, both the US and Brazil have been suffering a lot with these issues, both our countries. And it seems to be mainly been possible through social networks. As a specific example, in Brazil during our last election, some research showed that 98% of Bolsonaro's voters were exposed to fake news, and that 84% of them believed one of the main pieces that were circulated. That's a very large number. And years have passed, and it doesn't seem like much has changed, and not only in Brazil, in the world, and in the US also. So I'm curious to know, in your opinion, have we already seen the worst of this? Or are we still on a growth trajectory in this kind of post-truth crisis? And mainly, what are like the 2 or 3 of the main initiatives that we as a society should focus on to minimize this and to correct the negative impacts that all these social media can have on our democracies?
So it's this really interesting scenario that you've described, where it's kind of a chicken and egg scenario, where there was recently a study done in the United States about fake news around coronavirus. And the study determined that the number one spreader of misinformation around coronavirus was not groups of foreign actors spreading fake news, it was the president himself. So social media makes it possible to accelerate the spread of fake news and to exacerbate the trends, but it's the human beings that are creating the fake news that we need to be targeting as well. So I think that what we're seeing now is that people are becoming a little bit more savvy about what's fake news and what's not across the board, Certainly, it has a very strong impact and influence on what people do. We just had a situation in the United States where the president had rallied his followers to liberate Michigan, which is a state in the Midwest in the United States. And the FBI just foiled an attack against a kidnapping plot for the governor. So there was a very strong correlation between this call to action to do something to save Michigan from its governor, and then the governor being plotted to be kidnapped. So this information would not have been spreadable if it weren't for social media, but it's the humans themselves that are sending the messages that we have to start targeting as well. And I think that this is one of the things that has come to light over just going through the cycles and seeing where the misinformation is coming from. Yes, we still have problems with foreign actors injecting misinformation into our social media networks, but we also have a breakdown of democratic discourse in our own countries. And I think that we need to really empower journalists and nonprofit organizations and third-party organizations who can validate and verify and fact check. Because, for instance, when we just found out that President Trump has coronavirus last week, that was not publicly announced by the White House. That was publicly discovered by journalists. And if it weren't for the journalists who were doing this constant digging and working around the clock to find out what the truth was, we would have no idea. I have no confidence that the White House would have announced this on their own. So I have a very, I think the antidote for fake news is real news by trusted, respectable sources. And that comes from people who actually are trained to do that work. The disinvestment in journalism is really worrisome for any democracy, especially when it comes to local news. We have entire states that have almost no local newspapers in the US now because they've all been broken up. And it's extremely hard to make a living as a journalist. So I think that that is the cure for the fake news phenomenon, is more real, verified news.
Alexis, I'd like to go back a few steps in history. Right at the end of the Cold War, there was a kind of a consensus that the more middle class we would have, the more technology we would have, would bring more democracy. What went wrong?
That is a question for, you could write an entire book on that question, I'm sure. What went wrong? I think one of the things that went wrong was we didn't anticipate how quickly technology would develop. So with every step in the technological revolution, there's been shifts in how people adapt to that new world. So when television became something that we watched 7-10 hours a day, people started participating less in community activities. This scholar named Robert Putnam wrote this book, very famous book called Bowling Alone, where he talked about literally the fact that people were not joining bowling leagues or other community organizations as a sign of the decline of civil discourse and democracy, because people were not engaging in real life activities. Now with technology, where we all have essentially supercomputers in our pockets, we call them phones, but they're really quite advanced computers, we have even less incentive to engage with other human beings in real life. Now, it'll be very interesting to see post-pandemic if we're so tired of looking at our screens that there's some sort of resurgence of connectivity with humans, where people do go to events, do join clubs, do join organizations where they can be involved with other people. Because I think we're seeing that just living a virtual life is not as fulfilling as we need it to be. So it doesn't exactly answer your what went wrong question so much as talk about what I think could go right after we get past this pandemic that we're in.
I have a question regarding the possibility of technology being used within politics. And I was discussing with a friend after watching the presidential debate of the US, and we were talking about how much of a difference there would be if there was, for example, some kind of mechanism to be fact-checking everything the candidates say, because in that way we'd be able to actually know what is being said and what is true and what is not. And I believe that would really help in terms of like understanding where the fake news are coming from. And I wanted to know a little bit about your perspective on that. Like, how do you feel like technology is going to be able to get in those fields, or if it's always going to be a dream?
It's a really great question, because there's so many advancements in AI, for instance, and machine learning, that it's not that far off to think that we could have real-time fact checking. However, we're always going to need humans in the loop to ensure that it's being interpreted correctly. We're very close to having real-time fact checking, even with just the people that are doing the fact checking while the debates are happening. It would be the way that the debates are arranged in the United States. Both parties have to agree to the rules of the game. Sorry, the rules of the debate. It seems like a game sometimes. There's this little slip. The idea of having real-time fact-checking would probably be rejected by the Republican Party at this point, I would imagine. But it would be, let's imagine a scenario where we had that happen. There's real-time fact-checking. The tricky part is machine learning, and even with humans doing content moderation very quickly, there's a chance that they would miss nuance. And there's a lot of nuance that happens in these kinds of forums. The second thing is, the debates are not just about presenting facts. It's a kind of political theater. They're presenting themselves as a persona that you can imagine as a president. And there's a lot that goes into that beyond the actual factual content of what they're saying. It's their delivery, it's how their facial expression looks when they're getting information that conflicts with what they're saying. It's how they handle attacks. Do they get flustered? Does a fly land in their hair and do they not do anything about it? I mean, there's all kinds of things that go into what constitutes the value of a debate that actually has not much to do with the facts. But I think it would be a fascinating experiment to see how people would react to that kind of technology.
Alexis, how the US should be worried about foreign interference in its politics?
I think the US should be very concerned, because it clearly impacted the outcome of the 2016 election. In terms of, there's been a lot of study that has been done now on the amount of fake news that was spread that came from foreign actors during the 2016 campaigns. And it influenced the kinds of discourse that people had, the kinds of things that people thought were important to discuss and talk about. Excuse me, my other technology is ringing. So I think that it's something that we should continue to worry about, because when you interact with information online, the expectation is that the person that it looks like it's coming from is a real person. So this is another question, is it a person or a bot? We're kind of assuming that there's a lot of information that we see is from humans, but actually are coming from bots. And then the second thing is this person who they say they are? Are they actually a Black activist in the Black Lives Matter movement, or is it someone from Russia who is posing as someone in that position? So I think we have to be extremely savvy media consumers. And one of the things that requires is for us to slow down, which is really hard. The technology companies could make this easier by creating sort of virtual speed bumps in your scrolling. Twitter recently introduced a new feature, which if you want to retweet a headline, but you haven't clicked it, it shows a warning and says, maybe you should read this article before you share it. That's the kind of virtual speed bump that I'm talking about. So ways that technology companies can kind of slow us down, get us to think twice before we share content that we might not know where it comes from. But we need them to introduce these tools. And it's in the same way that when you want to have people slow down from speeding, you introduce physical speed bumps into the road. I think we need virtual speed bumps, because it's too addictive, the content, to reasonably expect people to just slow down on their own. I just don't think it's going to happen.
Alexis, continuing on the topic of international relations and also on the similarities between the US and Brazil, historically, both countries have had a very big importance in the international scenario, diplomacy-wise. The US being the largest economy in the world, the largest military power in the world, in the Brazil for a history of a strong, independent diplomatic position in general, and, you know, always opening the UN speeches, for example, and so on. But it seems to me that right now, this picture has been shifting for both countries. Both the US and Brazil don't seem to get all the attention or the importance that they once had in the international diplomacy world, I should say. And they're both also growing further apart from the international multilateral agencies that they once helped create. So how can we interpret all this? How do you see the current role of the US and Brazil in diplomacy right now? And can their previous positions still be recovered somehow, maybe?
So this is something that troubles me. I've been watching it happen. I used to work at the State Department, so diplomacy was my bread and butter. And I worked at the United Nations mission, so I would go to the General Assembly every year. It breaks my heart to see how both the US and Brazil have shunned those institutions that they helped to create and support all these years. But it's also, I feel like it's foolish. It is walking away from the opportunity to build alliances, build coalitions. The world is too big and complex, and the problems that we face are too big and complex for any one country to tackle them alone. For instance, climate change. It's not going to go away. It's not something that any one country can fix by itself. We need to be engaged on these multilateral kinds of institutions to ensure that we can have a coordinated response. So I think it's really short-sighted of both the US and Brazil to have walked away from these kinds of alliances and coalitions. I do think that it can be regained. I think that it's a matter of leadership. And I think that if we had a different kind of leadership in both countries who refocused energy and attention on the importance of multilateralism, that we would see the world start to take these countries seriously again in that arena. But I don't think that that's how we're viewed in the world right now. I think that it's very much a position of confusion and maybe even a little bit of pity.
Alexis, talking about multilateralism, I'm also very much in favor of it on a personal level. But we lost ground in the public debate to populism. Don't we have to have a kind of self-criticism? Why we lost so much ground?
It's an excellent question, and I do think that we need to look inward and examine what happened in our respective countries that permitted the populism to take over and for multilateralism to be put in the back seat. I think a lot of it has to do with fear, and populist leaders are very, very good at stirring up fear and playing on people's fears. In the US, for instance, the anti-immigration sentiment that has grown is not one based on science. It's not one based on logic. It's not based on facts. It's based on fear of someone losing their job. It's based on fear of terrorism. It's based on unfounded fears. And social media has a huge role to play in spreading those kinds of fear-mongering messages. And they're being exploited by people who want to be in power. So I think that this is something that we do need to look to the net states to be better in moderating the kind of content that is seeking to incite either violence or to incite panic, because it's irresponsible, and I think that it's effective, which is one of the reasons why populism has taken the front seat in both of our countries. And this is a tricky area because I don't personally think that the tech companies should act as the arbiters of what is good content. But I do think there needs to be regulations, perhaps federal regulations, in the same way that you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, that you can't incite panic online. So I think there needs to be some sort of regulations around that. Not censorship, but regulations.
If countries' institutional design still struggles to keep pace with all this evolution of tech industry, is there a risk of tech companies overtake nation states somehow in many senses? What is your perspective on this?
I think that they already are more advanced in a lot of ways than countries are, the net states, in the sense that they are global in their reach. And if they don't like the laws in one country, they can simply shift to a different country with different laws. We saw this with Facebook. Right before the GDPR took effect, they moved 2 billion users out of data centers in the EU back to the United States so that they would not be subject to the EU regulations. So they are learning very well how to navigate on a global scale, kind of above country laws and borders. But at the end of the day, they still don't have land and they don't have armies. So these are two things that I think will keep them in check in a way that will give governments and nation states the primacy in the relationship for some time to come. We are seeing more investment in, for instance, land and in physical infrastructure from net states, but I think there's still a ways to go before we have to worry about them really taking the front seat in this game.
Alexis, what is the impact of technology in the diplomatic world? How diplomats are acting now compared to the past, to the pre-technology era?
So it's interesting. There's actually a bit of a rollback. I was working at the United Nations mission when WikiLeaks happened, when the hundreds of thousands of State Department cables were made public. And the impact of that was that diplomats almost immediately stopped putting things in email. And they would only have phone calls or face-to-face meetings because they were worried that if they put something in writing, it could get leaked. So, and I work in government, I've been working in government for 10 years, and I have more meetings and phone calls now and fewer emails than I did 5 years ago, because people are more and more nervous about putting things in writing. So in terms of diplomacy, it's actually kind of taken a step backwards, away from technology. People are not trusting the technology because it could be recorded, it could be leaked, it could be shared in a way that they're not comfortable. It's almost like we're back to sitting on a park bench to have secret meetings rather than using email, which is much more efficient. Not across the board. There's definitely work that happens. We're having Zoom conferences and meetings and phone calls, but there's a nervousness and almost paranoia about leaks that did not exist 10 years ago.
Bringing it back to the topic of the global influence of the net states, I think it's really interesting to think that the analysis you made is technically for the US, but it really expands as we consider the global influence the net states have. And my question is, do you think that in the long run, these companies will become more diverse and globalized, or the general sense of nationalism will always keep them kind of grounded?
It's a very good question. And I know that a lot of the companies, a lot of the net states have local hubs. So for instance, Facebook just is making a big play for Africa. They just invested in a underwater submarine cable, which cost, I think, somewhere around $6 billion to provide connectivity to 28 countries, I believe, in Africa. And they're opening an Africa office, which I believe will be staffed largely by locals, combined with people from other countries as well. So I think that as they want to expand their markets, they're going to need to engage more on a local level and have to adapt content and to the culture that they're working in. That said, they're all based out of the US, the big ones. And I don't think that's an arbitrary or accidental coincidence. I think that that's something that has to do with the way that US regulatory system is set up to be sort of this Wild West for technology, that you can get away with so much. So as long as that's the case, I think it'll be a form of American ideas and cultures being pushed into other countries, adapting for the local culture, but still being very dominated by this American sensibility.
Also on the topic of the physical limits of each country and the global presence of these net states that we have now. In a recent event here in Brazil, actually, we had a recent episode where a federal court had Twitter take down several accounts linked to influencers that were in a fake news promoting scheme, pretty much. They were very popular accounts. However, soon it became clear that Twitter only stopped these accounts from being accessed from inside the country, and a simple proxy or VPN still made it possible for these people to access their accounts and continue to promote whatever they were doing. So this brings a lot of questions about the limits or the actual jurisdiction that each country's judiciary systems will have over these virtual matters. And as you mentioned, you know, the US concentrates a lot of these countries. So that kind of gives the US a lot of power also in the virtual world, I think. So what can we think about this now? Like, what are these perspectives for these kinds of disputes? Are we going to start having an international digital judiciary system, or what can we see coming from this in the next years?
I would not be surprised, because this is, I mean, think about this. This happened with the EU as well, with the right to be forgotten, where the provision where you can request certain information about yourself be taken down. There was a lawsuit put forth because Google originally said, okay, for instance, if a citizen in Spain is saying, I want my information to be taken down from Google in Spain, they would do that, but not necessarily from finding it on google.com or Google for any other country. And even if a Spanish court ruled that Google had to do this, who's going to enforce it? There's nobody out there that can really crack down on making sure that these companies comply with these local regulations. And we've seen this across the board with, like, the International Criminal Court, for instance. It's something that exists and has brought a few cases to completion, but generally these international bodies don't have teeth enough to really enforce global laws and norms and regulations. So I'm not sure how it's going to work moving forward, but I would not be surprised if there was some sort of international body stood up for precisely these kinds of purposes. Make a great point.
We don't know what we don't know. And we've been through these 3 stages of users without thinking about the responsibilities, outcomes, and risks, and so on. And now more than ever, we must be aware of our own ignorance, right? And the question, Alexis, is what are the questions should we be asking? I mean, what are the issues we are not even considering in this whole new world tech is building for us? Do you have any suggestions and questions for us to keep in mind?
Oh yeah, this is the big one, is we don't know what we don't know, and things are happening in real time, and then only in retrospect do we realize what we've walked into. It's like we've walked into quicksand and only realize when we're up to our necks what has happened to us. So I think one of the big things we need to think about is the way we spend our time with other people, and to make a conscious effort to ensure when we're past the pandemic that we're spending time also in person with people, because there's a different dynamic when you're in a room with someone or when you're in a room with a group of people and you can see eye to eye, you can make eye contact. It's much harder to be a troll if someone is looking at your face. It's much more difficult to spread fake news if somebody else can be right in front of you and say, wait, where did you get that information from? And counteract that kind of messaging. So I think we need to find opportunities to be in physical spaces together and have actual in real life interactions more than we do. And I think the pandemic has really brought this to the surface, how much we miss. I was at a work event the other day where I had to go into a physical space with a colleague of mine, socially distanced, wearing masks. But even with the masks, it was just so nice to see a person that I knew. I thought, like, oh my God. And I thought, wait, why is this so nice? Like, I see this person on a screen every day. What's the difference? But there is a difference. And it's not necessarily something we can measure. It's something to do with body language and with just sharing the same physical space with a human being, communicates something and generates some sort of energy and understanding that you don't get in a virtual environment. So I would say the thing that we have yet to study and figure out is, what do we lose when we lose the physical interaction? And why is it so important that we still have them? So that's one thing I would think we need to pay attention to.
Most of the analysis say that the post-pandemic world will be more digital. And you are saying, in a way, the opposite. You mentioned resurgence of human contact. You mentioned the necessity of slowing down in technology. So what is going to happen in the post-pandemic world?
Yes, I'm definitely not a prognosticator. I can't tell the future. But I do think that we are feeling the impact of the loss of physical contact and human contact. We're social creatures, and I think that video technology has made it amazing strides. The fact that we're able to have this conversation right now, but I guarantee you, if we were all sitting in a room together having this conversation, it would be a little different. There would be a different energy, and there would be different outcomes. And I don't know exactly why, except that we feed on the entirety of the communication experience, not just seeing facial expressions, but seeing all body language and all manner of reacting to the environment. So in the same way that diplomats have lots of technologies they can use, but they're kind of pushing them away to go back to one-to-one conversations, I think that even though we have all of these video technologies now, once we are able to have interpersonal connections again, face-to-face, that we will do the same. And it's just a guess, but I think that maybe it will look different than what we're used to. I'm not missing the packed subway car commute, I have to admit. I don't look forward to going back to a subway car that's filled with people, but I do miss having a coffee with a friend. So I think those kinds of interactions we're going to see more of, because we gain something from them that we can't replace in any other way.
Alexis, I feel like this discussion was so important and valuable to like everyone who's in this call right now, and I am so very much grateful. However, I do feel like it is still a very much privileged opportunity, I would say, especially taking into consideration that only one in every 4 people in Brazil don't have access to internet. And I guess if we want to spread the word and actually be able to organize ourselves as a whole, as a society, we need to spread the word. And I was wondering, how do we make the discussions such as the one we had today more relevant to everybody?
It's a really great point, and it's something that you're right. We are very privileged to have access to the internet, so we can use Zoom and we can have video chats, but we could easily broadcast this on the radio. One of the things I think we forget about is the earlier stage technologies that reach so many more people. Radio, newspapers, TV, we can still use those earlier generation technologies to repackage the content that we're creating on digital technologies so that we can have a broader reach. It's funny, I was talking to someone the other day about a podcast, and she'd been working in the business for so long. She said, I don't remember when a radio program became a podcast, but we still use the radio. We still broadcast on the radio. So I think we forget sometimes that there are simpler technologies that exist that can reach many more people and are worth using.
Thank you so much for your time. What a privilege to listen to you. It's really, we learned a lot. We could spend here hours listening to you. Thank you very much on behalf of Canal Brazil and Brasa. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you all for your wonderful questions and for this amazing conversation. I am such a fan of Brazil and look forward to when we can all be in a room together someday.